Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to this CSIS program, Reporting on Identity in Today's China, a conversation with Emily Feng. I'm Scott Kennedy. I'm Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics here at CSIS, and I'm delighted to invite all of you to today's conversation. As regular viewers of our programs know, I've been traveling to China for a long time, and I've lived there intermittently over the last 4 decades. Being on the ground in China, there has been central to understanding the country, which is an immensely complicated place because of its scale, its diversity, and how it changes over time so quickly. Foreign correspondents, China scholars who do field work, and business people who live in China are our critical eyes and ears, tackling tracking developments and trends. But being in China and doing reporting, doing research there, business on the ground is harder than it's been in a very long time. The Chinese government has reduced access for reporters, not renewing their visas, making it difficult to report when you're on the ground. The pandemic and geopolitics has made it harder for scholars and business executives as well. Today, we're joined by a group of some of the world's savviest China watchers who have observed China from different perches, from on the ground, from abroad, from the world of journalism, from academia, and from business. And we're going to talk to them today about what it means to be Chinese. Because after several thousand years, that the debate over that question is actually still far from settled. And the answers to those questions has huge implications for how China and the world get along or don't. Our lead guest today is Emily Feng, who is currently an international correspondent for NPR, covering China, Taiwan, and beyond from her base here in Washington, D.C. Feng joined NPR in 2019. Previously, she served as foreign correspondent for the Financial Times. Then she was based in Beijing, and she covered a wide range of topics, including human rights and technology. She's won numerous awards for her reporting and journalism, and I'm going to mention just 3 of them. In 2024, she won the Hugo Shong Reporting Asia Award for exhibiting the highest standards of international journalism in a series of reports on matters of importance specific to Asia. In 2023, she won the Daniel Shore Journalism Prize, awarded to a rising public media journalist 35 years of age or younger. And in 2022, she won the Shorenstein Journalism Award for her overall reporting on the Asia Pacific. Emily has just published a fantastic book, Let Only Red Flowers Bloom, Identity and Belonging in Xi Jinping's China, from Crown Books. We're going to let her get the program started as she'll share what she learned reporting in China and in writing this book, which everyone listening should read as soon as possible. I'm then going to turn to our 3 other guests, introduce them, and give them an opportunity to respond to Emily and do so from their own perspectives. And then we're going to have a group discussion for the remainder of the hour. So Emily, thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you for your reporting, and thank you for writing this book. Let me turn things over to you.
Thanks so much for the kind introduction and for having me. And it's such an honor to be here with Mark, Lucy, and Michael. I worked with Lucy. Lucy taught me a lot of what I know and a lot of the reporting that ended up going into the book. I did because I was Lucy's colleague at one point. Michael I met in Taiwan, and his work is fabulous. And Mark is a friend from both China and Taiwan. So I think that you kind of thread the needle in the reporting that went into this book. So to set the setting for my time in China, I moved there July 2015. And looking back, I realized it was bookended by 2 key events. I moved there, I still remember the date, July 13th, 2015. So this was exactly a week, I know now, after something called the 705 lawyers crackdown, named after the date that it happened, July 5th, 2015. And this is when there was a coordinated sweep of about 3, maybe even 400 human rights lawyers who were detained or arrested. And many in the years since have been disbarred or even been given prison terms. But it was kind of the start of Xi Jinping, who had just become chairman about a year and a half, 2 years earlier, showing what kind of ruler he wanted to be domestically. And it set the tone for the reporting conditions that Lucy and I worked in for the next couple of years. Uh, a lot of the stories ended up being defined by Xi Jinping's policies or policies that had his touch. And his concern, I realized as I spent more and more years in China, his concern with um, shoring up Chinese identity and this idea of the Chinese nation state. We hear a lot about the rejuvenation of China, securing its borders. National security has become more of an emphasis. But as I was reporting stories from both the economics and politics of it, I felt one underlying thread that connected all of these different facets was this concern with, well, what is Chinese and what are we safeguarding? Um, Stepping back a little bit, I can talk about those questions in a bit, but stepping back a little bit, I think this book was only possible because of the unique combination of reporting conditions that we had in China at the time. In some ways, reporting in China is ideal. It's an incredibly big country. It has amazing public infrastructure. It's really cheap to travel around. There are big stories out there like the continent of Africa or India, but they don't have the same kind of infrastructure that lets you hop around from story to story, I think, with the ease that China offers. And it's also physically really safe for a female reporter to report there. So I think that's how I got the diversity of stories and was able to see so much of China, whereas that might have been more difficult to do in another region or another country. Um, but why I wanted to focus on identity is I think that there are different visions for what China stands for, how it wants to develop. Those ideas were still very much in play when I moved there in 2015. And unfortunately, the Communist Party under Xi Jinping has taken a much stronger stance for its version of how China wants to develop and what it wants its citizens to think and how they should behave, how they should speak, what ideas they should consume. And I think that this concern with identity undergirds items in the news that dominated our coverage there when I was based in Beijing from 2015 to 2022. It undergirds kind of all the amped up national security laws that we've seen, certainly the national security law in Hong Kong, everything we've seen in Xinjiang and in other areas that are dominated by non-Han ethnic groups. Even I think some of the more strict data protection laws and ideas of data sovereignty and cyber sovereignty that we've seen come out of China and become quite influential among its regional neighbors who have been inspired by these policies of cyber sovereignty. And I start the book with a prologue about two leaked documents. One is called Document 9, which came out when I was still in university, actually, but it was leaked by some Chinese journalists. And it's this internal Communist Party speech where Xi Jinping talks about his priorities for governance as chairman. And they're all in the realm of ideology and ideas and culture. And that struck me looking back because these are immaterial things, but they had such material consequences for people's everyday lives and the resurgence of the Communist Party as a governance mechanism, not just as an ideological backbone for the country in the years that I was there. And the second document that I start the book out with is the text of a speech that Xi Jinping gives when he's still head of the party school, where he's talking about, well, why did the Soviet Union collapse? And his prescription is that it basically split along sectarian lines, that the Soviet Union as an entity was so split in terms of both the republics it had set up among different, essentially ethnic groups, but also politically. There were too many factions and ideas, and there was no one, quote, man enough to stand up to that. And the implication being that he is going to be man enough to step up to these fissures that he sees in Chinese society. When I was writing the book, though, I wanted to celebrate these, I mean, perhaps Xi Jinping might consider them weaknesses, but this organic diversity that has always existed in China, and I think underpins the evolving project of what China is. And I defined identity really broadly. This covers everything from what we traditionally might think of as identity markers. So, there's a chapter about gender and how people look at that in China, at ethnicity, at language policy. But I also broaden identity to think about things like political rights or economic visions for the country. How should it best develop? And then I go broader. So the book starts out on the urban east coast of China, kind of the economic heartland of mainland China. Then we go to the historic borderlands of the Qing Empire. And finally, I go to Hong Kong, then Taiwan, and I end up in the US with stories of the Chinese diaspora and how they're thinking about identity, their relationship to China, even as they're, for the most part, American citizens living in the US and how they're navigating the current US China relationship. And I have to admit, and we can talk about this too, I think a lot of people who have read the book have asked me about the personal parts of the book, which I initially resisted writing. There's more I perspective in the book than I'm comfortable with as a journalist. But it was something my publisher pushed me to do. And I think that she was correct in doing that because undeniably my interest in identity, these themes of identity among different Chinese communities, is because it's something that I think about personally. Being a Chinese American who was reporting in China for an American outlet at a time when tensions between the two countries was getting more and more, was ratcheting up, informed, I think, my fascination with how other people were conceptualizing who they were, how they belonged, and what they saw their foils being in Chinese society. I ended up writing most of the book in Taiwan. So I moved there at the end of 2022 and just left last December to move to DC. And being in Taiwan, we can talk about this as well. Being in Taiwan for sure shaped the form of the book, and I think the ultimate direction that the book took as well. So that was something unexpected, to conceptualize and report the book in China and then to write it in Taiwan. And with that, I guess we'll open up the floor to Lucy and Michael and Mark.
Super. Well, thank you, Emily. We're going to hopefully get into some of the individual stories in your book in the remainder of the program, but I did want to turn now to our other three guests who, from their various perches, have watched China for a long time and have amazing insights. Let me introduce the three of them now, and then I'll turn to each of them in turn. Michael Szonyi is professor of Chinese history and former director of the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard University. He's a social historian of late imperial and modern China. His research focuses on the local history of Southeast China from the Ming Dynasty to the 21st century using a combination of traditional textual sources and ethnographic style fieldwork. His books include The Art of Being Governed, Everyday Politics in Late Imperial China. His books transport us back in time to describe what it was like to live in China several hundred years ago and more recently. But this is not Michael's only claim to fame. He also is deeply interested in China today. He and I were colleagues together in the Public Intellectuals Program for the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, and he's editor of 2 editions of the book, The China Questions, with Jennifer Rudolph, published in 2018 and 2022. Lucy Hornby is a non-resident senior associate in CSIS's Freeman Chair in China Studies. She first moved to Wuhan, China in 1995 to teach English with Princeton in Asia. A planned 1-year stay became 2 and then 20. Lucy briefly worked as a journalist for Dow Jones in Singapore before returning to China as a reporter for Reuters. As deputy bureau chief of the Financial Times in Beijing, as we've mentioned, she worked alongside Emily Feng. Lucy returned to the U.S. to attend the Nieman Fellowship for Journalism at Harvard and has also served as a visiting scholar at Harvard's Fairbanks Center. A fluent Chinese speaker, Lucy has won international awards for her coverage of China's largest and most indebted companies. Finally, Mark Dreyer is Senior Director for Marketing Communications at the American Chamber of Commerce in China. Formerly a reporter with Sky Sports in the UK and Fox Sports in the US, Mark has been based in China since shortly before the 2008 Olympics, where he's worked with a number of media outlets, both domestic and international. He's a regular commentator and analyst on the booming Chinese sports industry, and in 2022 published Sporting Superpower, an insider's view on China's quest to be the best. I know it probably goes without saying, today he's speaking for himself and not for AmCham China. Thank you, all three of you, for joining Emily and me on today's program. Let me first turn to Michael for your remarks, and then we'll go to Lucy and then Mark. Michael, over to you.
All right, great. Well, thanks so much to Scott at the CSIS for setting up this terrific event. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So I love the book. That's hardly a surprise. I was reminded multiple times through the book of actually listening to the NPR stories that became chapters in the book. And so it was sort of interesting to think about how those stories have translated to print. I think identity is a really thoughtful and clever way to frame a conversation about a dozen interesting figures in the Chinese-speaking world today. I'm going to make two quick remarks so that we have lots of time for discussion. The first is that all of us who work on China and write about China are being told, being instructed that we, along with our colleagues and in China, are being told that we need to tell the China story well. This is an injunction that's come from the very top, from Xi Jinping. And what this really means is that in the eyes of the party state, there is actually only one story. And so telling the Chinese story well is to tell that official story. If you fail to tell that story, then you're not telling the China story well, and you're not a friend of China. And this is a kind of tension that all of us who write about China and speak about China publicly have to face. If you fail to tell the China story well, and you are of Chinese descent, that's even more serious. It's much more serious. And so I think one of the interesting themes that comes out of the book for me is what we might call the kind of globalization of pressure on Chinese identity. Not a new phenomenon, but certainly something that's much more salient in the last couple of years. And so Emily's kind of expanding circle really captures that quite well. Second point I want to make is actually to relate the book to my own work. I'm writing a history of modern China from the perspective of a rural society, or to put it another way, a history of modern Chinese villages. And I can't remember, Emily, if we talked about this when we met in Taipei, but what really struck me on reading the book, and I want to be clear that this is not a criticism of the book, it actually reflects both the challenges of reporting, but also the concerns and prejudices of Chinese leadership and Chinese elites. I want to highlight something that in a sense is missing from the discussions of what China is and what it means to be Chinese. And again, not a criticism of the book, but actually a comment on that conversation. The rural, home to hundreds of millions of Chinese, and to which more than 1 billion Chinese, because of the nature of the household registration system, still have close connections, is something that's almost completely absent from constructions of Chinese identity today. The rural is just a place to be from. And we see this clearly in Emily's stories about the migrant workers who drowns her daughter, Sun Dao, the business magnate who builds up a business empire and then loses it. The rural, for the first time in Chinese history, is almost entirely disassociated with agriculture, which for most of the history of the construction of Chinese identity was central to the economics of being Chinese. And this comes out lovely. There's a lovely way in which Emily brings this out in the story of the scooter thief, I've forgotten his name, who goes, like, needs to get away from the city, goes back to the countryside, but doesn't know how to farm. And so he's just kind of killing time in the countryside before he gets back to where the action is in the city. And so I'll just close with an observation about this interesting tension between the rural as there's a long tradition of this, the rural as the repository of authenticity, the rural as the repository of identity, as the object of nostalgia, the source of China's Volksgeist, right? Like the core to this idea of what it means to be Chinese, coupled with the virtual irrelevance of the rural in most discussions of identity going on in China today. There are, as I said, hundreds of millions of people whose lives are wrapped up in rural communities, and they are the sites of whole other dimensions of, as Emily put it so nicely just now, the organic diversity of Chinese identity. So I just thought that was really interesting tension in the book. And Emily, we can collaborate on another volume that puts those concerns front and center. Thanks very much for involving me today.
Sure. Thanks, Michael. And we're going to come back to that tension in just a bit. But let's first turn to Lucy and get her feedback.
So I guess my job is to say, how nice it was to work with Emily. which it was. But also, I think for many of our listeners may not totally appreciate how being Asian American or Chinese American can impact your reporting. And I think, Emily touches on this in questions of identity, but maybe she's a little too modest to say how, personally implicated you can get in China. Traditionally, most foreign reporters, of course, tended to be white, not all, but many. And so the idea of what a foreign reporter should look like often was white. And that as Asian American reporters became more and more frequent, it was really interesting for me to see how that could work for you and could also really work against you. So Emily speaks really perfect Chinese, in case our audience doesn't know that. But it also, looking similar, having that cultural body language, it can help you. People can be more welcoming. They can be more, more trusting sometimes. I know sometimes I would show up in a place and people would look at me like I just dropped down from the moon, literally. But it can also really, really work against you. And that feeling of being betrayed or pushed back at or rejected because of who you are. If I remember correctly, Emily did a totally innocuous story about, was it eating snails? And suddenly the blowback that she got from the Chinese media system was intense, very scary, and I'm sure very rattling personally. So I hope that's something she could talk more about. But I think that's also something our audience should understand, that when you are a journalist, you put a lot of yourself on the line. And when you are a journalist in a country that is so ambivalent as China is about your identity, about what's a real Chinese person, about what an overseas Chinese or an Asian American owes to China. And on the flip side, too, the reactions you get from many of your readers. Are you really American? Or, who do you belong to? Who do you report for? Who are you representing? These are all issues that I think our readers should appreciate, that someone who, like Emily, is full-bore American, but also full-bore trying to understand this other country. It just has all these cross currents that people might not anticipate. And so I do hope that Emily will be able to talk a bit more about that, and that in reading this book, which really is masterful, you'll appreciate how much goes into it that may not be visible.
Thanks, Lucy. That's really terrific comments. And I think it highlights the courage that Emily has shown in her reporting and what she's done in this book. Mark, let me turn to you.
Thanks, Scott. And first of all, I'm genuinely humbled to be on this panel with such amazing resumes, but thank you for having me on. I wanted just to start by saying how important it is that Emily has told these stories. There's barely anyone left in China who is able to tell them. There's a reference in the book about the professional journalism ranks having been hollowed out. We're lucky enough to have two of the best in recent years in Emily and Lucy on the panel today. But both on the Chinese side, and I've worked with fantastic Chinese journalists that I've learned just an incredible amount from over the years, and also foreign journalists as well. There's hardly any foreign journalists still around in China. And if they are, they're so overwhelmed with the day-to-day that they're not getting out to tell these really important stories. Michael made the point about telling China's story well and all of that sort of nonsense. But that's a good point that's also worth talking about. I'll mention a couple of things that resonated more on the sort of the media and the censorship and so on. I first came here in the build up to 2008 to 2007. It felt restrictive back then, but looking back, that feels like a golden era in terms of what you could publish. Certainly, in China, the scooter thief chapter that was referred to, there was a phrase there about the parallel worlds of information. And I think that's so key to understanding China today. In my other, I have my sports hat and my business hat with AmCham. When we try to bridge that gap between DC and Beijing, it's almost impossible. We go to DC and people look at us like we're aliens, and then we come back and we report what we've heard, and everyone's looking at us going like, what planet did these guys just land back from? It's so it's down to the censorship and the parallel worlds of internets and so on, and what is being talked about and the stories that are being allowed. The chained woman story, I think, was a great example of that. Apart from the fact that it deals with China's terrible internal PR, where they're misreporting the story and they're changing the story 3 times, and no one, of course, believed it. But the citizen journalists everywhere looking for the truth, whether they're former Chinese journalists, people want the truth. They want to hear these true stories. And so I think, again, this is just so important that these stories are able to be told. And hopefully people in China in some way will be able to hear about these stories as well. Just a final thought. Scott, you started at the beginning about what it means to be Chinese. And from my sports world, there's been some really interesting examples. I'll bring up 2. Eileen Gu, the Chinese-American freestyle skier who dominated headlines at the Winter Olympics. Is she American? Is she Chinese? Is she both? I mean, of course she's both, but people they're not happy with that. You have to be one or the other. You have to pick a side in today's world. What do you do if you're her? Like, she genuinely feels 100% Chinese and 100% American. You don't have to be 50-50. So I think that's really interesting. Further down the spectrum, you have Brazilians who are playing for the Chinese national soccer team. When I first mooted this idea in a column that I had about 10 years ago, I had actual hate mail, people coming in and saying, you don't understand. They wouldn't understand what it means to be Chinese and sing our anthem. They could never play for China. And I thought, well, most countries have foreign-born players in the team. It's allowed under FIFA rules. Why doesn't China do it? It needs all the help it can get. Frankly, when it comes to soccer, everyone knows this. And then they finally did it. I'm not taking credit for the idea. But some of these players, they've played their whole career. They feel very close to the country. They've made their lives here. They have families here. So they feel Chinese to some extent. They're never, of course, going to be accepted as Chinese, but this is, somewhere else down the spectrum. And you have, I think, everywhere on the spectrum about what is Chinese, what is foreign, what is in the middle. Can you be either or? Can you be both? And everything in between. I'll stop there, I think, but there's so much to pick up on. And Emily, thank you for writing this. It was at every page I was jotting down notes, and I've had to sort of select very carefully what I wanted to raise today. But thank you. It was a joy to read.
Well, thank you, Mark, Lucy, and Michael for your feedback. Let me see if I can sum up, pull together some of the threads that they mentioned, Emily, and turn things back to you. I think one of the things that it's key in your book and the discussion that we're having is telling China's story well is what is the official view of the quote unquote right idea of Chinese identity? How would they sum that up? And curiously, why it differs from what Michael described about rural China, given how many Chinese are from rural China. I guess the second idea is, could you give us a story? Several characters from your book and your reporting have been named, but could you sort of give us an example of a story of Chinese identity that diverges from that story, from that supposed correct official narrative? And I guess the third question related to that is, why is this so risky from the Chinese leadership's perspective and from the party's perspective? Why is an organically diverse, evolving Chinese identity problematic for them? Why isn't it something that they could easily embrace and be comfortable with? What's the threat to having a diversity of views about what it means to be Chinese? I'm not asking this as an idiot. I really just, and people may think I am an idiot, but honestly, I don't get why it's such a threat. Let me turn things back to you.
I mean, long story short, I don't think it's a threat either. I think on the whole, it can be a strength because there are so many diasporic Chinese and there's an incredible soft power that they could be wielding. But to get back to your first couple of questions, I think when China says to tell the China story, what they're saying is tell the story of economic development. And the story of economic development, which has been incredible over the last 40 years, is completely dominated by cities. So that leaves out the rural, it leaves out the countryside, it leaves out people who are not engaged with industries that are associated with industrial production or with cities. And I think Michael's point is fabulous. And I take it well because these stories are important. I remember the year that COVID broke out, we had planned a year-long series on the countryside, which we scrapped because a lot of villages had some of the strictest COVID controls. They weren't letting, ironically, urban residents in, thinking that they were bringing the virus with them. But, you know, I come from a farming family. My father was raised as a Chinese peasant. My mother was raised on a commune. And that history of being a peasant under Chairman Mao, 1/4 of the family was sent to labor gulags because they were associated with bad elements, shapes my family history today, how I think about China and interact with it. And I think this is probably true of so many Chinese in China and outside of China. So when they say tell the China story well, I think they're thinking about collectively, how has the average livelihood of Chinese people improved? There is definitely narrative heft to this and a reason it's important to report those stories. But I also want to look at individually how groups and people are affected. And it's not just about economics, it's also about, you know, politics. It's about how people's livelihoods and ways of life and the ways they think have been preserved and evolve. And I think in more and more, I was seeing an emphasis on the party state and the party and its ideology becoming so much more central to national identity and also personal identity, this idea that the party was somehow relevant to people's individual lives. There was more of an emphasis on Han-centric culture, or at least behaving like you were Han, even if you were part of the other generally defined 55 ethnic groups. I think there's been much more of an emphasis, and this has accelerated since I left China in 2022, on gender, on the role of women, and defining gender in relation to reproduction once again. Whereas gender has always been an important distinguisher in Chinese society, even when under Chairman Mao, these distinctions were supposed to be leveled out. But I think it was defined in those decades more in terms of economic production, in terms of your political contributions, and therefore everyone had the opportunity to contribute. Now I see it defined more and more in terms of family rearing again. And I wanted to explore that in this chapter on the chained woman. So the reason why I think Xi Jinping cares about all of this and why I think Chinese leaders care about this is ultimately they're thinking about the nitty-gritty nuts and bolts of governing, but that stems from bigger ideas about what do we stand for, how do we build a cohesive identity out of essentially what is a modern nation state based on fragments of empire. And that's always been a tension even for previous dynasties. I think it's very, very difficult, and I don't envy communist leaders for trying to make a good case for why different peoples in the current boundaries of the PRC should all believe in the Chinese project. But the people I profiled are not, for the most part, dissidents. They're not petitioners. They're not the kind of famous people who are trying to take a stand against the Communist Party. They're often people who are born very much feeling like they can contribute to the Chinese project as defined by the Communist Party, but then suddenly find themselves on the outside of that for various reasons when policies change, when ideas about who can be Chinese change. One of the characters who ends up giving the book the title, Let Only Red Flowers Bloom, is this man who I call Yusuf, that's its Arabic name. He also has a Chinese pen name and a Chinese name because he considers himself Chinese. He also happens to be Hui Muslim. And in his teenage years, he has this kind of born again religious epiphany and decides to become a practicing Muslim, not just culturally one. And he times it well. It's in the 90s, so there's room to do this. He can study abroad. And he spends his entire life trying to write Muslim texts, making the case that Islam is somehow uniquely Chinese, that it's based in Chinese culture and philosophy and Confucian and Taoist principles, which makes him kind of unpopular among certain Muslim groups. And he tries to thread that needle between being both Chinese and Hui and Muslim, and someone who's very much connected to communities in Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, but also his home base in central China. And it doesn't work out well for him. But I thought he emphasized really, really well for me this idea that being Chinese is an evolving identity. It's a big umbrella. There are many people who I think are trying to explore different facets of it. It's always been changing, and that's the nature of a civilization that expands and contracts territorially, because at one point it was an empire. And I think those tensions will always remain. And it's not just about economic interest and political interest. I do think there is an identity aspect to this as well.
Let me ask you one more question and then go back to the group about this idea of identity, because you tell a lot of stories about these various individuals. Do you think these individuals have the same sense of the need for China, for what it means to be Chinese, to have some sense of diversity to it? Would they see everyone else in the book whose stories you tell as equally authentically Chinese in their own way, or are in some ways some of them accepted Xi Jinping's definition, this narrow definition of what it means to be Chinese and tell the story well? I'm just curious about potential variation, rifts, tensions amongst some of the people you tell. Is this a Chinese political system versus the people, or even within society, are there these debates about identity?
For sure. I think that if you put all these characters in conversation with one another, they would disagree with one another. So I think that some of the characters from Taiwan who are thinking about Taiwanese identity in relation to PRC identity, to Chinese identity, would have a disagreement with perhaps the Hong Kong bookseller who I profile. I think that many people, even Chinese intellectuals, liberal-minded, well-traveled people who I interviewed over the years in China, many of them don't care that much about what's happening in Xinjiang. And so they might think that the chapter that I did about this Uyghur family who finds themselves separated from their children across countries, they might not consider that a story about Chinese identity. I think it is. I think it's about PRC identity, and it's integral to also then Chinese identity. But I think even within China, and this is the point of the book, there are many different ideas for what China is. And I wanted to highlight those, but it also means that those visions conflict with one another sometimes, even among people who find themselves on the outside. I realized I didn't answer Lucy's question about what it was like. I mean, part of me has a hard time accepting that this matters, that being ethnically Chinese, looking the way that I do, sounding the way that I do matters in reporting on the ground in China. So for a long time, I didn't talk about it because I didn't think it was relevant, even if everyone was right in thinking this was one of the reasons why I had to move to Taiwan. But there were numerous times when I was accused of using my Chinese face. I mean, this was literally the word, the phrase, 利用我的中国的面孔, to do reporting on the ground in China, that I somehow was hiding my true identity in doing reporting for foreign forces. And then on the flip side, there was also this narrative in meetings with Chinese officials that my true identity was Chinese. And so I should, again, be telling the China story well, the story of fabulous economic development. And basically that's it. So yes, it worked both ways, but increasingly, I think towards the end of my time in China, it was working against me. And I didn't want to confront that or accept that at the time.
Well, let me turn back to Mark, Michael, and Lucy for some thoughts. I've got another question that I want to raise because we're in a DC think tank, but I want to hold off on that to still talk about China and identity and not U.S.-China relations yet. Maybe Michael, do you have what responses to Lucy's reactions? And
sure. Well, I mean, really rich ideas in the last exchange. Maybe I'll just pick up on one, which is the increasing Han-centric construction of Chinese identity. And if you travel in urban China, you see that a lot with the Hanfu movement. This extraordinary thing that people who haven't been to China in the last few years will be unaware of, which is that you ride the subway in Beijing, you ride the bullet train, and there are people wearing what they think people wore in the Tang Dynasty. And you see this especially at tourist sites, where a big part of being a tourist now in China, doesn't matter where you are, is to dress up in what you think people wore. And I guess the reason I mention this is I think it provides a bit of an answer to Scott's comment about why this matters, because one of the things that's happening, and I don't want to negate the agency of the young people who are doing this, but this must make Xi Jinping very happy, because the reduction of Chinese identity basically to kitsch is a way of ensuring that the much more contested and potentially politically problematic expressions of identity that are the subject of Emily's chapters are not going to be front and center in people's minds. If being Chinese means wearing some clothes that somebody on some influencer has said is true to Chinese spirit, well, what does Chinese spirit actually mean? Chinese spirit is a much more complex construction than, as Emily points out. And so I think part of the construction identity is not simply becoming more Han-centric, it's also becoming reduced in ways that make it less meaningful. So just a thought. I don't really have a question following off that, but I'd be curious what Emily sees about that.
Emily?
I wonder if this is part of a general flattening of identity everywhere, where so I guess we're still in an age of maybe the last few months of globalization, where we look for things that are authentic and distinct, but then we have to kind of package them in a way that are easily accessible and understood. And I see the Hanfu movement as part of that. I haven't studied this. I've always been bewildered by these people who walk around at 11 a.m. in long polyester robes. But do you get a sense that they do it because they're looking for an identity themselves, or because why?
Michael, you got an answer?
I don't have an answer. I think so there's a lot of debate among academics about the impact that popular Chinese nationalism plays on policy in the PRC. I don't think actually popular nationalism plays any impact on what Xi Jinping decides to do on any given day. But this search for an identity, to flatten it in this way neutralizes it, right? It means that it cannot have, and this is why I think that probably the Hanfu movement makes people in Zhongnanhai very happy, because it makes Chinese identity quite harmless to them. Now you're asking about what the people who are doing it are thinking, and I suppose I might answer the same way, that this is a way to express a nascent nationalistic and patriotic identity in ways that are not politically problematic and politically risky. So many of the people in your book, I think, are being patriotic in ways that get them thrown into prison and get and force them to make commitments that go far beyond what they initially intended, as you point out with your comment. So I think that's what might be one way of understanding the appeal of the movement.
Yeah, let me turn to Lucy.
I haven't studied it either.
Lucy, what's your thoughts on these questions and things you've been thinking about because of the book?
Well, I was thinking that a lot of the book, obviously it's political because politics is ruining these people's lives. But it's not political in the sense that it's looking at individual Chinese, right? Not the focus is not the political system and why it is. But the fact is, there's a hell of a lot of self-hatred in the Communist Party, and it's a ideology that came out of an intellectual sitting in Trier, Germany, passed through the Soviet Union, landed in China in a party that then spent the next 50 years trying to destroy everything that appeared to them to be Chinese. And so I think that there's an organic identity among Chinese people, which, as we know, is extraordinarily rich and can be surprisingly diverse for outsiders who expect China to be a monolith. But the party itself is the one with no identity, right? They don't know what it means to be Chinese, and they're uncomfortable with most of the authentic expressions of what it means to be Chinese. And so that's why you get these sort of perverse and twisted and ultimately brittle and hollow ideas of the only way to be Chinese, because they're the ones who don't know and who aren't comfortable with it. And I think that kind of a pathology, what Emily's seeing is the way that pathology hits ordinary people who are really just trying to live their life in an upright moral way, hits them bang in the face. But you see it repeatedly and in very weird ways, right? Like, we all have to be Chinese, but not this author, not that time period, not that dynasty, because that one doesn't count because it's not part of this, single rule ever since 2000 years ago, their problem is they don't know, right? And, I think especially in the United States today, right, when you start having a very brittle top-down idea of what it means to be your country, then by nature, you end up excluding a lot of the bottom-up richness and ultimately trying to suppress it and repress it. And so that's always been my explanation for the kind of weirdness that you see around this artificial, what appears to be a very artificial, almost fake sense of, okay, you have to be this way.
Mark?
I'm chewing on that for
days. Go ahead, Emily.
No, that's extremely thought-provoking.
Absolutely. I got a lot of ideas I want to share, but I'm suppressing because I want to have you guys weigh in. Mark?
No, I completely agree with Lucy there with the top down versus bottoms up friction. I was just going to tell a very brief story about the only time I went semi-viral on the Chinese internet, which was in 2013, and it was around the time of the two sessions. And I got collared by a Global Times video journalist who basically asked me, did I know about Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping? And I said, yes, I knew who they were. And in contrast to all the other tourists in Beijing who had no idea, the internet concluded that I must be a spy because I knew far too much about China. But I made some joke about the NPC and the CPPCC and how I referenced the fact that all the ethnic groups came in with their colorful dress because, of course, that's what they show on CCTV. Like they celebrate this. Look how rich we are with our 56 different groups. But it's so two-dimensional. There's nothing. You're not allowed to have this diversity. You're not allowed to have anything behind it. And that stands out. I'm sitting here in Taiwan. I'm based in Beijing most of the time, but it reminded me of the chapter on Xinjiang. I was there in 2009, 4 months after there'd been riots there, and it was like a different continent, not even a different like region. It was just so different, and the richness of China is incredible. It's such a strength. Lucy made the point about US today, but certainly in the past, you go to a place like New York, and as a Brit, I would say, where are you from? And no one would say American. They'd all say, well, I'm Italian, Irish, or I'm Hungarian, Dutch. And they're all sort of drawing on their backgrounds and celebrating this with their traditions, and it's front and center. In China, unfortunately, that's just not the case. People want to have this, but that erasure, that horrible story about the young girl in Xinjiang, and the parents can't even speak to them anymore, and some on the other end of that spectrum, the richness of the diversity just pressed away, squeezed out, as it were. That was just what I was thinking about as everyone else was talking.
Can I just say that I went viral for a story about potty training my kid, so I think that you really can count your blessings.
You never know what's going to land. I guess I was thinking about different views about identity and politics in societies. And I was thinking a lot about Asian values, the debate over Asian values from the 1990s, which emerged partly out of Singapore, but elsewhere, even had people in China discussing it. And um, having also traveled to Singapore recently several times, this debate comes back to me. And I think that there's just a view about identity and politics that differentiates conservatives and liberals, people who are worried about future and change and what that means for their own position and people like them. And so you see this amongst conservatives around the world who long for some past, it might be a mythical past, where they feel more comfortable, where they know where they stand, and where they stand relative to others. And that provides a level of comfort to them, which is very difficult particularly in a world that seems changing in ways that they can't understand and control. And those who are more liberal with a small L, not a big L, um, embrace change. They don't find change threatening. They're comfortable with diversity because diversity also creates a new space for them in which to be welcomed and embraced and part of what is right. And so I think conservatives and liberals around the world have had this debate. And we saw that in the Asian values debate. I think we see that in China because it is a very, very conservative group of people running China now. And the way that they talk about identity and values and the party just simply reinforces that. I wouldn't say that all Chinese leaders have felt that way. I think you've seen diversity over time, especially if you go back to the 1980s and sometimes in the 90s, you would see different discussions about identity and religion. So I don't know if this is just a pure on pathology of the party itself or where the party is at this stage based on the leadership that is currently running the country. So there's just one thing that struck me. That I think the second is this debate that goes back to the early 20th century about how you get a country of such diversity to cohere, and the famous description of China as a sheet of loose sand. And if you don't have strong party leadership and some amount of top down, that sheet of loose sand will fragment, and you will cease to exist as a country, which will be bad for the people and bad for China's place in the world. So I think there's this sort of conservative view, and then there's sort of this sort of nationalistic view about how to just keep the place together and not fragment. I wanted to turn now to ask about uh, China's place in the world and U.S. China relations. As you describe in the book, Lucy, and all of you have experienced, going back and forth in and out of China is harder. Sometimes reporters like Lucy can't go back, and Emily can't go back. But and also the relationship between China and the United States has been deteriorating. And we've taken a giant leap forward in that deterioration over the last week with these tariffs and discussions now of decoupling. And I'm wondering, what does this deterioration in the relationship between China and the United States or the West mean for the people in your book, and the type of stories that they're likely to have going forward? Is this going to make it more difficult for there to be a welcoming of diversity of experiences around what it means to be Chinese? Is it going to help? Is it going to be irrelevant to the lives of these people? So I'm just curious about what a more isolated China or a more isolated United States means for these people. So let me turn back to Emily and then get thoughts from the rest of you before we wrap up.
Certainly for the people who are in the last chapter of the book, the Chinese diaspora, and also some people in the Taiwanese diaspora who I interviewed in the US. This is a direct impact because they're increasingly going to be asked to choose a side. They're increasingly going to be under suspicion about what they really stand for, both in the US and also in China, or their relatives or business partners, whatever, in China. So I worry about them, and I worry about myself, about my family. I think for people who I profile in the first half of the book, who are in the realm of ideas, who are thinking about different political visions, who are part of the constitutional reform movement of China in the early 2000s, for these people, it's been a huge intellectual blow to see the US become so politically isolated because they looked up to the US. They learned a lot of their legal scholarship and building legal systems in China from the US. And so to see that system of law be challenged has been very demoralizing, because the US has been a really, really important philosophical foil, I think, for people thinking about broader questions of political economy, of political governance in China. So not just from a trade or political perspective, I think in terms of these more mushy ideas in the book, what the US is doing has a huge impact.
Michael?
Sure. Well, I'll make two quick comments. First of all, Scott, I found your attempt to situate this in a kind of a global context of conservatism versus liberalism really thought-provoking. I do think that the Chinese case doesn't map perfectly on to the story you were telling, in part because much of the debate about Chinese identity, in particular the Asian values debate, is actually about articulating a distinctive Chinese modern identity that is different from a kind of global identity. I think that was in the background of much of that debate. But it's certainly interesting to think about the two in juxtaposition. In response to Emily's last comment, I just want to zoom really back out and say a word about how this affects not just the people, how the deterioration in the relationship affects not just the people in the book, but all people in China and all people in the United States. And I say this as with Scott, a former participant in the National Committee's Public Intellectuals program. I feel quite strongly we don't know whether the relationship going forward will be one of hostility or enmity or cooperation or competition or perhaps even friendship. It's not good for the people in your book, and it's not good for any of us if the two countries know less about one another. That in any future scenario, both through journalism, through scholarship, through people-to-people diplomacy, it's not good for the people in your book. It's not good for the planet. It's not good for us and our children for channels of information to be closed off. So I feel that's something we, in all of our respective capacities, should keep in mind, as I know that everyone on this panel does.
Lucy?
Amen.
Mark, you want to wrap things up a little bit?
Just echoing what Michael says, one of the things we've been looking at AmCham is the terrible levels of student numbers, two ways, particularly U.S. students in China right now. Headlines in the last week or so, that Chinese students could be under threat in the U.S. And that would be so dangerous for the future. Who are going to be the diplomats of the future? Who are going to be the journalists of the future, the business people of the future, understanding those two countries? If China needs to stay open to the world, people need to travel there and experience all the wonderful things that China has. And Chinese people need to go out and experience the world, and so people can get more of a sense. Just it's so important that sort of people to people, but it feels pretty brittle right now.
This has been a fantastic discussion prompted by an extremely important book, which I again encourage everyone to go read. I think the word that sticks out in my mind about this book and the discussion is empathy. Is the ability to put yourselves in the shoes of the people that you're reporting on and share their stories. Their stories are their stories. They're no one else's. And no one else has a right to define what their stories are. But I think you do as good a job as anyone can to share those and share the diversity of stories from China and from outside China, which matters tremendously for how we as outsiders look at China and how Chinese interact with us. So I want to thank you, Emily, for showing that courage, that ability to reflect that empathy in what you write, and that you continue to do so for all of us at NPR and everywhere else. And I want to thank Lucy, Michael, and Mark for sharing your thoughts today and for all the work that you all are doing to help act as bridges and storytellers in each of your own ways. To everybody watching, thank you for joining today. We are going to continue to, as best we can, to analyze China and tell the story about China's relationship with the world as empathetically as we can. We can't hold a candle, I think, to the work that Emily is doing, but we're going to keep trying as best we can. So Emily, Lucy, Michael, Mark, thank you for joining, and look forward to continuing the conversation.